Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when adolescence was a bit more ceremonial than stressful, though in some ways perhaps even more complicated. So settle in, dim the lights, fluff your pillows, and let your mind wander gently to the cobblestone streets of ancient Rome. Imagine, if you will, a world where your social status was determined not by your hobbies or your GPA, but entirely by who your parents were. And if your parents were unusually dramatic, or let's be honest, just plain eccentric, well, then your teenage years could become a full-on theatrical experience without any applause. Now, let's picture a typical Roman teenager. And by typical, I mean extraordinarily unusual by modern standards, because of course they were. Most teen boys from noble families, let's say the patricians, the ones with marble houses and servants who probably knew more about them than their parents did, spent their mornings being tutored in Greek literature, philosophy, and rhetoric. Yes, rhetoric. Essentially, this meant learning to argue convincingly about things they probably didn't care about. Imagine being 15, barely able to shave, and having to convince a room full of elders why your father's property taxes were fair. Naturally, they were often only partially successful, and failing at rhetoric could mean mild shame, or in more dramatic cases, a slight reduction in the number of people bowing when you entered a room, which, for a teenaged ego, could be devastating. Teen girls, meanwhile, were engaged in their own uniquely confusing social education. They learned spinning and weaving, which, in hindsight, seems less about skill and more about a slow lesson in patience and endurance. Social etiquette was paramount. Every gesture, every glance, every smile was potential scandal, or worse, a familial embarrassment. One misstep, such as laughing too loudly at a dinner party or showing excessive interest in philosophy rather than embroidery, could ripple through the household gossip networks like wildfire. And because these households were enormous, imagine dozens of relatives, slaves, tutors, and the occasional freedman. The ripple effects were constant. Teens were essentially living in what we might now call a high-drama, slow-motion reality show. But let's not imagine that all Roman teen life was strictly about social survival. Of course, there was the occasional amusement, though it was often framed as something very serious. Games like Ludus Latrunculorum, a strategy board game, were supposedly training exercises for future generals. A teen losing at Ludus Latrunculorum might learn the harsh lessons of strategy and defeat, or might simply sulk in a marble courtyard until a servant brought a new board. Similarly, chariot races were popular, but teenagers weren't exactly allowed to race professionally, so most of their participation was limited to watching, which, from a modern perspective, sounds like the historical equivalent of scrolling social media for hours. Perhaps it was even worse, because here, every wrong cheer or faint smile at a losing competitor could be judged by everyone around you, including that one uncle who could make your life socially unbearable for years. And then there was schooling in moral virtues. Ancient Romans were very fond of teaching children the fine points of discipline, courage, and honor. In theory, this sounded excellent. In practice, it often meant long lectures on self-restraint delivered by tutors who probably had not restrained themselves in any significant way. Imagine a teenager being scolded at length for showing emotion while secretly thinking, "I just want to eat this fig and maybe take a nap." Of course, the tutelage was relentless. Every moment of a teen's day was either a lesson in history, philosophy, physical fitness, or some combination of all three. Sleep, when permitted, was often brief, and even then, one might wake to a distant uncle counting how many words you had memorized of Homer. A little stressful, but in a strangely comforting way, predictable. Family life, of course, was its own peculiar labyrinth. Roman households, particularly those of the upper class, were rarely quiet. Elders argued about property. Younger cousins quarreled over minor slights, and servants often held more power than the average teen realized. One common experience was a constant tension between expectation and reality. You might be expected to act like a philosopher, but your father would insist on inspecting your swordsmanship. Or you could be expected to demonstrate impeccable manners, but your mother had no patience for forgetting the correct seating order at a dinner. The sheer number of contradictory demands could be mind-numbing, which may explain why many adolescents eventually sought solace in less supervised areas. like sneaking into gardens, attempting minor mischief, or simply staring out their windows at the bustling forum, watching life continue as if they weren't under perpetual scrutiny. Social hierarchies were endlessly fascinating and endlessly irritating among peers. Status was less about family and more about small accomplishments, witty retorts, or simply surviving another day of public embarrassment. Some teens achieved fleeting fame for daring acts, like sneaking into the Senate chambers, or more realistically, stealing grapes from the kitchen and blaming the household dog. Naturally, such accomplishments were both admired and condemned, depending on who was observing. Peer approval was a delicate, precious commodity. One misplaced word or joke could result in weeks of whispered mockery. In some families, gossip wasn't just recreational. It was a form of social training. Teens were encouraged to absorb, interpret, and respond appropriately, though no one ever admitted aloud. And speaking of food, Roman teenage diets were practical. Meals were designed more for social performance and family image than personal enjoyment. A young patrician might be served bread, cheese, fruit, and the occasional fish, all meticulously arranged. Eating too quickly, too messily, or too greedily could result in subtle but long-lasting shame. Some teens, of course, sought out forbidden delights. Figs, honey, and wine, in small quantities, became private rebellions, because even in ancient Rome, teenagers understood the profound satisfaction of a quiet indulgence when no one was watching. It's a curious thought that across millennia, some pleasures remain universally irresistible. Let's drift onward to hobbies, or what might loosely be called hobbies. Education emphasized arts, letters, and physical training. Learning to read and write was considered essential, as was mastering Greek, which everyone insisted you speak perfectly, even if it sounded like a slightly confused imitation. Music, poetry, and drawing were encouraged, ostensibly to build moral character. Some teens took this to heart, producing surprisingly competent poems or sketches. Others, less so, which resulted in polite nods and faintly disappointed smiles from tutors. Physical activity, meanwhile, was unavoidable. Young men practiced wrestling, running, and fencing, while young women were expected to maintain graceful movement, posture, and poise. A teen failing at any of these could experience mild embarrassment, though it rarely escalated into anything more dramatic unless one was exceptionally unlucky or exceptionally clumsy. Of course, adolescence is often about rebellion. Roman teens had their own versions, often quiet and insidious. Sneaking into forbidden areas, reading books meant only for adults, or even engaging in whispered conversations about politics or philosophy could be considered rebellious. And naturally, any rebellion was more thrilling precisely because it could be punished by the entire household. One famous example from history, and quietly terrified for any teen involved, was a young heir of a senatorial family who, in a bout of daring mischief, set up a mock Senate debate in the atrium. He lost control of proceedings, resulting in minor chaos and a lifetime of subtle parental scolding. The lesson? Rebellion, even when small, carried consequences, and even when the consequences were light, they lingered in memory like an old, persistent ache. Romance, naturally, was another slow-brewing complication. Courtships were carefully orchestrated, and casual affection was discouraged. Teens often found themselves in arrangements dictated by family politics rather than personal desire. It's almost endearing, in a slightly tragic way, to imagine a 16-year-old being asked politely but firmly whom they plan to marry, while inwardly hoping for a quiet friendship or the occasional stolen glance. Such situations were, unsurprisingly, fraught with tension. Sometimes, young Romans found solace in poetry, writing letters they never sent, or composing small songs about longing and boredom. The contrast between adolescent yearning and rigid social expectations made for an environment that was at once structured and emotionally turbulent, though always under a calm, disciplined exterior. Even chores and daily responsibilities contributed to the overall atmosphere of mild tension. Teens were expected to assist in household management, overseeing slaves, organizing meals, and learning the subtleties of social diplomacy. These tasks, while mundane in concept, were often fraught with tiny hazards. Forgetting a step in a meal preparation mispronouncing a guest's name, or failing to notice an uncle's subtle glare could result in lingering embarrassment. Daily life was thus a careful balancing act, where every action, even the smallest, was observed and judged. And yet, there was a rhythm to it, a slow cadence that, over time, became oddly comforting. So, as we drift slowly through the life of a Roman teenager, we notice a pattern. Their existence was structured, highly observed, and occasionally, quietly humorous. It was filled with small victories and constant minor anxieties, all framed by a society obsessed with status, propriety, and subtle control. Imagine the gentle weight of expectations pressing down, the soft, persistent whisper "do better," while still allowing small, secret pleasures, like a stolen fig, a quiet poem, or a whispered joke. And in that, we find both the strangeness and the universality of adolescence. Across centuries, the tension between personal desire and societal expectations seems to echo softly, like a lullaby of awkwardness and discovery. And now, as we pause for a brief moment, consider this. If you were a Roman teenager, tasked with navigating all of these rules, obligations, and secret rebellions, what would you have done? Would you quietly comply? Or would you sneak out to the gardens under the moonlight, imagining a life less scrutinized? Think about it. And if you feel inclined, tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your gentle, hypothetical rebellions. Comment your thoughts about surviving adolescence in ancient Rome. And so, as we leave behind the modest miseries of everyday adolescent life in Rome, let's drift gently into the slightly more extraordinary stories. The ones where the stakes were a little higher, the lessons a little harsher, and the absurdity of being young in a patrician household was taken to, well, almost operatic heights. We're talking, of course, about the heirs and heiresses of Rome, those who were expected not only to survive adolescence, but to emerge ready to rule empires, or, at the very least, to marry someone whose name would matter in history books. Imagine the pressure. Now, settle deeper into your pillow and let your mind wander among marble halls and shaded courtyards, where even the birds seem to know they were part of a carefully orchestrated tableau. Let's begin with young Tiberius, though not the Tiberius who became the notoriously grim emperor. At least, not yet. Even as a boy, he had a disposition that was quietly peculiar. Tutors whispered about his intense seriousness, his disinterest in most games, and his uncanny ability to memorize speeches that most teenagers would find excruciatingly dull. One can picture him in the atrium, sitting rigidly on a polished bench, reciting lines of Homer or discussing the virtues of certain military tactics with a calm, unflappable face. The irony, of course, is that while he appeared composed, he was likely simmering internally at the sheer monotony of being perfect at everything expected of him. Every teenage rebellion he could muster was subtle. Perhaps a delayed response in conversation, a faintly sarcastic remark, or a barely noticeable smirk when a tutor mispronounced Greek. Small acts, really, but they were his. Meanwhile, his cousin, let's call her Julia, a common enough name, though her family insisted on making her unique, was learning the other side of teenage distress. Girls of her rank were expected to exhibit both grace and restraint, which is a combination that can, in some ways, feel like attempting to balance on a marble column during an earthquake. Julia's mornings were filled with lessons in music, poetry, and the proper art of conversation. But naturally, life intruded in the most inconvenient ways. A pigeon might interrupt a lesson by swooping through the open atrium, scattering papers. A servant could misplace a writing tablet. Or perhaps the tutor, exhausted from repeating the same line for the 100th time, would sigh audibly, leaving poor Julia to wonder if she was a problem, the tutor, or the very nature of human existence. In these moments, the teenage experience could feel as much like existential philosophy as preparation for marriage. And speaking of marriage, it's worth noting that the teen years for Roman aristocracy were inextricably linked with the prospect of matrimony. Unlike modern adolescence, which is primarily a period of exploration and self-discovery and occasional snacking, Roman teens were already negotiating futures with the subtlety of diplomats. Families arranged alliances with precision that would make a chess grandmaster envious. One misstep, like showing excessive interest in philosophy rather than the family's preferred political ambitions, could redirect your life entirely. Imagine being 14 and having to smile politely while hearing that next year you might marry a boy whose nose was slightly too large, but whose father had excellent connections. The irony is that these matches were meant to consolidate power, yet teens often found the experience vaguely humiliating, and sometimes entertaining. A small smirk in the presence of fate, or a whispered joke about the arrangement with a cousin, became tiny victories. Let's wander, then, to the peculiarities of the younger members of imperial families. Nero, as a child, provides particularly gentle, if slightly alarming, example. The boy was surrounded by tutors and advisors, yet he exhibited tastes and habits that would puzzle any modern parent. He reportedly had a penchant for music and acting from an early age, a choice that, in his social context, was considered both charming and somewhat odd. While most boys were practicing rhetoric or fencing, young Nero was performing small plays, singing and exploring poetry. Of course, one could argue this cultivated artistry would later serve him poorly, but for now, it meant the household was occasionally entertained and occasionally exasperated by a child more interested in applause than in politics. Perhaps it was the first gentle lesson that adolescence is always slightly absurd. Meanwhile, other young heirs experienced equally strange pressures. Consider Gaius Caligula, affectionately nicknamed for his little soldier boots. Even as a boy, he was surrounded by a web of expectation, fear, and petty politics. Tutors attempted to mold him into a disciplined leader, yet the boy's natural inclinations often leaned toward mischief and provocation. He reportedly delighted in shocking or teasing adults in subtle ways. Imagine being taught, with all seriousness, how to speak with dignity before the Senate, while simultaneously considering whether it might be entertaining to trip over a toga or deliver an intentionally absurd comment. In these moments, we see how teenage life in Rome could blend education with a kind of performance art, often under the watchful eyes of parents, relatives, and advisors who themselves were performing roles of power. And then, of course, there were the strange, fragile aspects of health and heredity that affected teen aristocrats. Many of these families were extraordinarily careful about bloodlines, resulting in a curious mix of physical frailty and inherited quirks. One can picture a young girl delicately attempting to thread a loom while her older cousin quietly reminds her to maintain her posture, lest it negatively impact her appearance and, by extension, her future prospects. Or a boy practicing fencing under a tutor's eye while occasionally feigning from a minor illness because the family insisted on rigorous physical training despite a genetically precarious constitution. Adolescence, in this context, was not only about social navigation and education, but also about surviving a lineage that prized both appearance and heredity over, well, basic comfort. Another layer of subtle misery, or perhaps amusement, was the constant scrutiny of servants and attendants. In Roman households, slaves and freedmen often knew more than anyone else about the true inclinations of their young charges. They observed small rebellions, secret jokes, and minor frustrations. A teen might think they were being discreet, only to discover later that every misstep was quietly catalogued, discussed, and sometimes used in gentle reprimands by the family. The result, naturally, was a life of constant vigilance. Teens learned to moderate their laughter, time their sighs, and measure their glances. The art of subtlety, as we might now call it, was not optional, and yet the very fact that such observation existed created moments of quiet humor, especially when the teen realized they had been entertaining the household entirely unknowingly. Education, as mentioned, was intense. While some tutors were patient, many were perfectionists, devoted to teaching Latin, Greek, law, and ethics with almost monastic rigor. Students were expected to recite poetry flawlessly, debate with logic, and retain an encyclopedic knowledge of both history and philosophy. One could imagine a young Roman boy, frustrated by the unending repetition, plotting minor acts of distraction, perhaps a misplaced scroll or a dropped stylus, simply to break the monotony. Sometimes these acts were subtle, barely noticeable. Other times, they were spectacularly ineffective, leaving the teen feeling equal parts guilty and amused. And for those watching, including modern historians imagining the scene centuries later, there's a faint, almost soothing comedy in the repeated trials of adolescent ambition and boredom. Perhaps one of the more charming aspects of these lives is how teens found small, secreted spaces of enjoyment. Gardens, hidden alcoves, and even simple corners of the household became tiny sanctuaries. Here, a young aristocrat could breathe, write a secret poem, practice a musical instrument, or simply daydream without the oppressive weight of expectation. The contrast between the public, polished exterior and the private, slightly rebellious inner life is fascinating. It reminds us that even amidst extreme structure, teenagers throughout history sought moments of autonomy, however fleeting. Perhaps the human need for a quiet space, a stolen pleasure, or a moment of unobserved thought is as old as civilization itself. And yet, the social calendar continued relentlessly. Public festivals, family gatherings, religious ceremonies, and political events punctuated daily life. Teens were expected to attend, behave, and participate in ways that reinforced their family's reputation. Failure to smile correctly, offer the right greeting, or show the proper amount of reverence could ripple through both familial and public spheres. We can imagine a teen silently counting seconds until the next meal, while outwardly nodding gravely to an elderly senator who seemed to take personal offense at their posture, such as adolescence, magnified by history and social expectation, a gentle chaos of inner thoughts and external performance. It's important to note that, despite all of this, Roman teenagers were not entirely without play. Games of skill and chance were woven into daily routines. Board games, dice, and small sporting competitions offered moments of diversion, though always in a socially acceptable format. A teen might lose spectacularly, of course, and endure the quiet ridicule of friends and family, but the activity itself provided a rare opportunity to act spontaneously, if only in minor ways. Similarly, small acts of creativity, sketching, composing poetry, or experimenting with music, allowed teens to explore individuality. These pursuits, while seemingly trivial, often carried immense personal significance, especially in households where personal expression was otherwise tightly constrained. We can't overlook the slightly darker side, either. Some teens were exposed to political intrigues and ruthless power plays of their elders at an age when modern teens are still mastering basic social skills. Alliances, betrayals, and subtle manipulations occurred constantly, and while young people were not always participants, they were keenly observant. A teenager witnessing a minor scandal at a family gathering might later recount it in whispered conversations, noting alliances, favors owed, and subtle humiliations. Observation became a skill, sometimes more important than formal education. And in a way, it prepared them for future roles, even if it also instilled a gentle, persistent anxiety about who could be trusted. So, in contemplating the adolescence of Roman aristocrats, we see a blend of structure, expectation, subtle rebellion, and quiet amusement. There's a repetition of rigorous education, the monotony of social performance, the fleeting joys of secreted pleasures, and the undercurrent of minor dramas that never quite rise to full catastrophe. It is, in a sense, the perfect environment for both stress and understated humor, a slow-moving world of observation, self-discipline, and tiny personal victories. One can imagine lying in a quiet courtyard at dusk, listening to the distant murmur of the city and thinking, yes, this is life, but I will survive it, perhaps with a secret smile. And now, as we pause and breathe gently, I invite you to consider the experience of these teens. So, let's drift onward, slipping gently from the slow, nerve-wracking world of Roman adolescence into that equally confusing stage just beyond it, early adulthood. That moment when you're technically grown, officially responsible, and yet still entirely unsure of what you're doing. It's comforting to remember that this confusion is not new. The Romans were muddling through it too, often with a bit more ceremony, a handful of terrifying expectations, an occasional political assassination to spice things up. But don't worry, tonight we're keeping things calm, so we'll stick to the softer, sleep-friendly side of early Roman adulthood. Imagine you're a young Roman around 18 or 19. The toga gets a little heavier, not physically, but metaphorically. In that way, responsibility always sneaks up on you. One moment you're trying to avoid your tutor's glare. The next, you're being told to sit at the adult table and offer opinions that could, in theory, shape the future of the family. Awkward barely begins to describe it. And because this is Rome, everyone pretends they're not judging you while absolutely judging you, all at once silently and with impressive discipline. Take young Tiberius again, for instance. still our poster child for the quietly miserable aristocratic youth. As he edged into adulthood, his life did not suddenly burst into color. No, adulthood simply offered new shapes of monotony. He began attending public ceremonies with his mother, Livia, who was famous for maintaining the emotional range of a marble statue. You can imagine the poor boy, forced to stand beside her for hours, hands folded respectfully, face calm, eyes carefully neutral. Inside, though, he was probably wondering whether anyone would notice if he just stepped quietly behind a column and vanished. It was around this age that these aristocratic young men started participating in minor political duties, observing trials, appearing at Senate sessions, making tiny speeches no one really cared about, but everyone had to pretend were brilliant. For Tiberius, who was already an expert at looking serious, this was easy enough. The difficulty came from having to interact with senators who loved giving unsolicited life advice. Picture a group of elderly men explaining moral virtue and leadership, each one trying to outwise the other, while young Tiberius simply nodded, wishing he could be anywhere else. Perhaps in bed, perhaps eating grapes in silence. Anything. And then there were the young Roman women entering adulthood, who, if possible, had an even stranger transition. Julia, our earlier example, now found herself navigating the treacherous waters of elite Roman marriage. In adulthood, she was expected to show grace, intelligence, and a kind of polished pleasantness that few humans naturally possess. Her days became a pattern of dressing, attending gatherings, offering polite conversation, pretending to enjoy poetry readings, and being examined from head to toe by mothers-in-law, who viewed her like an acquisition they weren't entirely impressed by. Her new responsibilities included running parts of the household, directing servants, overseeing meals, and occasionally managing estates. None of this came with clear instructions, of course. She was expected to already know everything, instantly, effortlessly, and if she stumbled even slightly, she could rely on some distant aunt to lean in and whisper corrective suggestions disguised as compliments. It's soothing, in a strange way, to know that passive-aggressive relatives are a timeless feature of human civilization. Now, let's drift towards someone slightly more dramatic in his early adulthood. Young Nero. By the time he approached adulthood, he had already developed a taste for performance, but he also had a deeply complicated relationship with his mother, Agrippina. Calling it complicated might even be generous. She was ambitious, calculating, and absolutely determined to secure his path to power. Nero, meanwhile, was probably just trying to figure out who he was while being told at every turn who he should be. His early adult years were filled with training in philosophy, rhetoric, and the fine arts, supposedly make him well-rounded, but probably just overwhelming. He would practice speeches in the morning, attend lessons in ethics after lunch, and then be lectured on diplomacy during dinner. One can almost hear him sighing internally, longing for just one evening when no one asked him to perform a dramatic reading or recite Stoic principles. Historians later made fun of his interests, but honestly, he was just a young man trying to express himself. The tragedy is that he happened to be doing so in the center of the world's most political household. Let's drift gently over to Caligula, who, during his early adulthood, had already lost most of his immediate family to political purges. That kind of trauma tends to shape a person, though we don't need to explore the darker details tonight. The calming takeaway here is that even surrounded by danger, the young man maintained a veneer of politeness. He learned how to smile at those who might poison him, how to compliment senators who definitely disliked him, and how to pretend that everything was perfectly fine while quietly planning better days. Early adulthood for Caligula was essentially one long exercise in pretending he had no emotions, something many modern young adults may find oddly relatable. Meanwhile, the average aristocratic young Roman was dealing with far more mundane challenges. Managing finances, for one. Families often handed young adults small estates or business responsibilities. Of course, the young person rarely had any idea how to manage a vineyard or calculate grain shipments. They learned quickly, though partly out of necessity and partly because failing publicly was not an option. A mistake in accounting wasn't just embarrassing. It could become a full family scandal. Imagine miscalculating rent taxes, and then having an uncle loudly remind you for the next 10 years. Very calming. And because Rome adored ceremony, early adulthood meant being endlessly invited to gatherings, dinner parties, weddings, political banquets, sacrificial ceremonies, philosophy discussions. If you're imagining something glamorous, scale it down significantly. These events were slow, formal, and just slightly uncomfortable. Young adults were expected to stand in corners, nod politely, and pretend to appreciate speeches that sounded suspiciously similar to the ones from the previous evening. Everyone spoke in metaphors. Everyone discussed morals. And everyone tried not to spill wine on their tunic. Let's drift into another layer of early Roman adulthood, military service. Yes, many young aristocrats were gently pushed or shoved into joining the army, at least for a preliminary campaign or two. The idea was to build character. The reality was usually something far less flattering. Young aristocrats often arrived with polished armor, shiny boots, and a vague sense of bravery. Within a week, they discovered mud, boredom, and the uncomfortable reality of sleeping outdoors. It's reassuring to imagine a sheltered Roman youth standing in a cold field at dawn, wondering quietly why he ever left his warm villa. Some young men actually enjoyed military service, but others spent most of their time writing letters home, complaining about the weather. Tiberius himself, despite his later reputation, likely had countless moments where he wanted nothing more than to go home, have a quiet bath, and eat dinner indoors. But duty prevailed, as it often does in societies that overvalue tradition. Of course, not all young adults were sent to war. Some pursued political apprenticeships, shadowing older men, attending local councils, learning public speaking. These roles required endless patience. You sat quietly while older men argued about taxes, laws, and land disputes. You learned to stay awake even during the most boring speeches, which is actually a skill modern audiences of long films might appreciate. Sometimes, a young man would be invited to speak, and he'd rise, heart pounding, only to realize he didn't know how to hold his hands. There's nothing quite like the terror of having too many limbs suddenly. Meanwhile, young aristocratic women were entering their own new phase of life, running households, dealing with guests, and navigating marriages that range from tolerable to politely strained. They learned how to manage servants, how to store grain, how to plan formal dinners, and how to avoid conflict with their mother-in-law. They had to look composed while handling family politics that would exhaust most modern diplomats. It's strangely calming to imagine a Roman woman arranging flowers one moment and subtly resolving a domestic dispute the next, all with a calm expression of someone resigned to a lifetime of interruptions. Now, return to the theme of lineage quirks. Many young adults of noble birth inherited fragile health or unusual temperaments thanks to generations of selective marriage. Some were prone to fainting spells. Others suffered from nervous conditions. Still others had eccentric habits that family members either tolerated or ignored. One young patrician, for example, is rumored to have spoken in rhyme when nervous. Another reportedly refused to eat figs unless they were sliced at a very specific angle. A third disliked leaving his house on odd-numbered days. These tiny eccentricities didn't hinder their social standing, of course. They simply made them more interesting guests at dinner parties. And woven through all these early adult experiences was the ever-present pressure to appear dignified. Romans loved dignity. They lived for it. They collected it like stamps. And yet dignity, in daily practice, is fragile. A young adult could spend weeks acting with perfect composure, only to trip over a sandal strap at a banquet and undo all their progress. Senators would whisper. Aunts would sigh dramatically. Someone would say, "What a shame," and the moment would follow the young person for months. It was exhausting, really, try not to be human. So, early adulthood in Rome was a slow dance of responsibility, tedium, tiny joys, and politely concealed panic. People learned to smile at senators, avoid political pitfalls, balance household duties, and attend ceremonies that seemed designed to test their endurance. They woke up early, stayed up late, and developed internal monologues filled with gentle complaints. And somehow, through it all, they managed to create an empire. As you settle deeper into your blanket, let yourself picture these young Romans, walking through shaded courtyards, rehearsing speeches under their breath, pretending to enjoy long discussions about grain tariffs, and quietly wishing they were back in the carefree, or at least less responsible, days of adolescence. And before we drift onward into the next part of our quiet journey through Roman life, take a moment to reflect. If you were a young adult in ancient Rome, would you have embraced duty? Or would you have tried to quietly avoid every expectation placed upon you? Tell me in the comments if you're still awake. So let's drift a little further now, still wandering through the soft-lit corridors of ancient Roman adulthood, though we're keeping the pace slow. Because honestly, the Romans are exhausting when you look at them too closely. They lived fast, died young, and spent most of the middle part complaining about taxes, their in-laws, or the state of the aqueducts, which, to be fair, were usually either leaking, under repair, or mysteriously collapsing because someone's cousin pocketed the marble budget. Very relatable. By now, in the story of your hypothetical Roman life, you've survived childhood, endured the awkward teenage stage, and made it through the please don't let me get drafted years. And if you're still here, drifting along with me, that means you miraculously avoided dysentery, street crime, political purges, and your uncle's truly awful cooking. So well done. You're already beating Roman life expectancy. But adulthood in Rome had its own quiet chaos. It wasn't all bathhouses, wine, and lounging on couches while servants fed you grapes, which, by the way, is mostly a later artistic fantasy created by people who had clearly never tried lying sideways while eating fruit. Real Romans didn't do that. If anything, they would have mocked the ideal loudly, and maybe written a long scroll about why reclining while eating was a sign of moral decay in the youth. Because, of course, every era has that one guy. Your day, as an adult Roman, started early, earlier than any sane person would choose. And unless you were incredibly wealthy, and even then, only borderline wealthy, someone probably shook you awake around dawn. The sun wasn't exactly up, more like quietly suggesting it might rise eventually. Most people got up not because they wanted to, but because Rome did not care about your personal rest schedule. It was loud, chaotic, full of clattering carts and people yelling about bread. And if you thought you'd get a peaceful morning, you'd be dramatically mistaken. And honestly, that's one of the things that modern people underestimate. Rome wasn't the quiet marble city we picture. It was loud, dusty, cramped, and smelled like, well, not lavender. Let's leave it at that. All those narrow streets, the open drains, the crowds, the animals, and the vendors shouting like their goal was to rupture your eardrums before breakfast. Yes, it was vibrant, but maybe not in a relaxing way. So you start the morning with something incredibly Roman, mild irritation. You get dressed, probably in clothing that was already a little worn out, because laundry in Rome meant handing your tunic to a guy who washed it in ammonia. And by ammonia, I mean urine. Human urine. Warm, usually. Fresh. I'll give you a moment to be grateful for detergents. After that uplifting wardrobe experience, you head out. Maybe you're on your way to your shop, or your workshop, or your tiny rented stall, where you sell clay lamps that look like they were sculpted by someone using only their elbows. It doesn't matter. Rome loved small businesses. It loved them so much. It taxed them aggressively, inspected them unpredictably, and forced most of them into bankruptcy. Tradition is tradition. If you belong to the lower classes, which, statistically, you almost certainly did, you spend your morning dodging carts, stepping around whatever unpleasant things were being dumped out of windows, and try to keep your sandals intact, because Roman sandals last about as long as a loaf of bread at a gladiator after party. But maybe you were lucky. Maybe you moved up in the world. Maybe you were one of those upwardly mobile Romans who managed to buy their way into a comfortable income. Maybe you're running a bakery or managing a small tavern or trading olive oil to people who inexplicably ran out even though the entire Mediterranean was basically made of olives. And if that's your life, then you get another very Roman experience. Customers who complain loudly, frequently, and often dramatically. Romans love complaining. They perfected it. They wrote long letters about it. They carved their complaints into stone. They prayed to God specifically to request refunds for disappointing purchases. They would absolutely leave 0-star reviews on everything if they could, but you move through your day anyway. Rome isn't a city that lets you relax. There's always something happening. A neighbor hosting a loud family dinner. A political rally blocking the street. A religious procession that has decided today is the perfect day to carry a massive statue past your shop entrance, completely disrupting business. Or your cousin dropping by with a small problem that inevitably requires money. Romans always had cousins with small problems, mostly gambling. If you're doing well, you go to the baths in the afternoon, and this is where Roman life actually becomes pleasant. Warm pools, soft lighting, people chatting in a low, sleepy murmur. Yes, the baths were the closest thing Rome ever had to a spa. And while there were occasional arguments, minor stabbings, and the odd theft of sandals, most people behaved. It was too warm and relaxing to start trouble. The tepidarium was basically ancient melatonin. There, you'd meet friends, discuss politics you didn't actually understand, and listen to a poet recite something dramatically incomprehensible. And you'd nod along, pretending to appreciate the artistry, while mostly thinking about dinner. But adult Roman life wasn't all bathing, and pretending not to have strong opinions. There were also responsibilities, household responsibilities. If you were married, you now had the deeply Roman experience of arguing about family finances, complaining about in-laws, and trying to keep your family from accidentally violating 12 different religious customs before noon. Roman religion was complicated and unforgiving. If you forgot to sprinkle grain on the household shrine, someone would definitely blame you for every bad thing that happened for the next month. And if you had children, congratulations. You now had miniature Romans to raise. Roman kids had two main settings: loudly energetic or asleep in a corner like someone unplugged them. They played with wax dolls, threw sticks at things, and occasionally reenacted gladiator fights in the living room, much to the despair of every parent. And because children were considered tiny adults, they were often expected to behave with dignity and responsibility, which they never did, because they were children. But among all of this, the chaotic mornings, the noisy streets, the endless errands, there were the quieter parts of Roman adult life. The slow walks through markets at dusk, the way the city softened a little when lamps were lit and the crowds calmed down, the evenings spent on rooftops, listening to the distant hum of the city and hoping the neighbor's dog would stop barking eventually. Rome at night was almost peaceful, except for the occasional brawl, fire, or late-night drunken parade. But peaceful-ish. And then there was dinner. A Roman dinner wasn't always fancy, but it was social. Friends came over. Family came over. Neighbors came over even if you didn't invite them. People ate, drank, and exchanged gossip about politics, marriages, and which senator looked a little too enthusiastic at the last public execution. Morbid entertainment tastes. Those Romans. But all of this, the noise, the chaos, the endless opinions, was deeply Roman. Because at the core of it, Romans lived their lives with sort of bold, unfiltered sincerity. They didn't try to appear humble or reserved. If they had a thought, they expressed it, loudly. If they disliked someone, they said so, publicly, on a wall, sometimes, with hastily carved insults. Graffiti was the original Roman social media. And somehow, in this whirlwind of strange customs and loud personalities, you settled into your own rhythm. A Roman adult's life wasn't glamorous, but it was full. Constant movement, constant interaction, constant responsibility. And despite all the madness, there was a certain charm to it. The kind of charm you only notice when you imagine it from a safe distance, around 2,000 years later. So now we drift a little deeper into your adult Roman world. You start figuring out how to navigate the city's bureaucracy, which is a polite way of saying you spent a lot of time standing in lines. Romans invented the queue and made it as slow as humanly possible. Need a permit? Stand in line. Need to register your stall? Stand in line. Need to complain about the last time you stood in line? Stand in line. But the real test of adulthood came in the form of social obligations. Romans loved gatherings. Dinner parties, birthday parties, festivals, public games, religious events, political speeches. Your calendar was full, even if you didn't want it to be. And refusing an invitation was considered suspicious, almost offensive. People would assume you were plotting something ill or just tragically uncultured. And no one wanted that reputation. So you went. You attended dinner parties run by people who believed seasoning was optional. You sat through poetry recitations that lasted longer than most marriages. You stood in crowds watching chariot races where everyone passionately argued about teams of horses, like they were discussing sacred philosophy. And you laughed politely at jokes that had been circulating since the Republic. And through all of this, you tried to maintain your dignity, because Romans valued dignity almost as much as winning arguments. Even if you tripped on a cobblestone, spilled wine on your tunic, or accidentally called someone's grandmother Matrona of questionable morals, you pretended everything was fine. Romans were excellent at pretending everything was fine. Of course, adulthood also meant dealing with politics, not participating, just enduring it. Politicians in Rome were very dramatic. They made speeches that went on for hours, shouted accusations at each other, and changed alliances more often than they changed sandals. And every major announcement somehow ended with someone raising taxes. Again, you'd hear political gossip constantly. In the baths, at markets, in taverns, in the street, from your grandmother, who somehow knew everything before anyone else. Roman elders were like walking news networks, with opinions. And then, if you lived long enough, you reached that age where you could finally complain with authority. Complain about the youth. They don't respect anything. Complain about the politicians. They're ruining everything. Complain about the price of fish. Back in my day, it cost half as much. And though ancient Rome was chaotic, messy, and frequently absurd, there was something satisfying in surviving it. Something comforting in the routine. Something strangely cozy about living in a world where everyone was a little dramatic and everything was a little unstable, but life kept moving anyway. So now, as we drift toward the next part of your Roman story, just imagine yourself sitting beneath the evening glow of a Roman lamplight. Your day is done. The city is quieter now. The breeze carries the scent of bread and charcoal. Someone is playing a reed flute badly. And for a few brief moments, even Rome feels calm. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments, if you live your adult life in ancient Rome, what job do you think you'd end up doing? So let's drift a little further now, into the quieter corners of your Roman adult existence. The parts that don't usually make it into the grand historical narratives, mostly because they're far too ordinary, far too human, and arguably far too relatable. Historians adore emperors and battles. They love dramatic turning points. They're much less thrilled by the fairly average Roman citizen trying to balance household budgets, avoid social scandals, and not trip over uneven paving stones. But those everyday parts of Roman life, those are the places where the ancient world feels familiar. Comfortingly familiar, even if the constant threat of city fires and surprise inspections doesn't bother you too much. Let's return for a moment to your imagined evening scene. Lamplight flickering gently, the air softening around you, the city exhaling after a long day of being loudly alive. The Romans, for all their intensity, had a surprisingly tender relationship with their knights. Once the sun slipped below the rooftops and most citizens retreated indoors, Rome lost its sharp edges. The noise faded, the bustle dimmed, the chaos retreated into the shadows, leaving just enough movement to remind you the world was still turning. You might finish your small chores, maybe wipe down your stall, or lock up your workshop, or make sure the household shrine was properly tended to. Romans believed their household gods, the Lauras, liked regular attention. Neglect them, and you might as well be inviting a month of bad luck, spoiled food, and mysteriously injured ankles. Treat them well, and they watched over you, like cosmic landlords, but friendlier. Then you'd settle down for the evening meal. Nothing extravagant, because frankly, most Romans weren't dining on peacock tongues served on gold platters. That was a senator thing, an emperor thing. A deeply insecure, wealthy man trying very hard to impress dinner guests thing. For most adults, dinner was simple. Bread, cheese, olives, a bit of fish if you were lucky, or a little flush that week. Maybe some cooked vegetables, which Romans generally tolerated but never adored. And wine, of course, always mixed with water, because drinking it straight was considered barbaric. Only Northern Europeans did that. And the Romans were convinced it explained why those people were constantly invading things. After dinner, you might lean back on a stool or a couch, Not the fancy reclining couches and elite dining rooms, but something humbler, worn down by years of use. And you let the warmth of the lamps create that slow, drowsy atmosphere that creeps up on you when a long day finally relaxes its grip. Families talked quietly then. Friends shared gossip. Couples whispered about their neighbors' questionable choices. Someone told a story about a relative who once saw a god walking through the marketplace disguised as a beggar, and the children listened with wide, slightly skeptical eyes. Now, in the spirit of drifting gently forward, let's talk about Roman sleep. Because Roman nights were surprisingly social. Many families slept in shared spaces, partly because houses were small, and partly because bedrooms as we think of them now weren't really a thing for most people. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. And even then, half the household staff was constantly walking through those private spaces with trays of food or armfuls of laundry or jars of olive oil. If you ever wonder why Roman elites seemed permanently irritated, it's because they had the privacy level of a modern open-plan office. Most adults slept modestly early, especially those who had to rise before sunrise to get to work. But Roman nights were also broken into segments. People sometimes woke up in the middle of the night to pray, right? Wander around their homes, or stare meaningfully out the window while contemplating taxes. The Romans had a lot of taxes, enough to keep anyone awake at night. Occasionally, night watchmen would patrol the streets, muttering to themselves, carrying torches and trying to prevent fires, but mostly failing because Roman buildings had a habit of catching fire spontaneously. Oil lamps, wooden ceilings, and a deep cultural appreciation for cooking large meals indoors will do that. And then there were the street musicians who ignore the entire concept of sleeping hours. Flute players, drum beaters, the occasional amateur poet shouting verses to the moon. They all contributed to Rome's soundtrack, if you lived above a tavern or near a busy street. Your sleep schedule was determined not by personal preference, but by how quickly you became desensitized to noise. Now, drifting out of your bedroom doorway and into your next Roman day, you wake to a city already alive again. And adulthood in Rome meant juggling responsibilities from sunrise to sunset, plus any tasks the gods saw fit to assign indirectly through a series of unfortunate events. A broken pot here, a surprise tax collector there, a stubborn mule blocking the street just when you're late for an appointment. You know life. One of the most defining adult tasks in Rome was managing relationships, not the romantic ones, though those were complicated too. I mean social relationships. The network of favors, friendships, obligations, and mutual expectations that held Roman society together like a slightly fraying rope. Every adult depended on people higher up the social ladder, and in turn, someone depended on you. It was a system of carefully balanced debts. Not financial ones, although those existed too, but personal debts. If a wealthy patron supported you, maybe by offering protection, helping your business, or giving you a little extra grain during a tough winter, you owed them gratitude. Gratitude expressed through loyalty, political support, or showing up to applaud loudly when they hosted public games. That last part was important. Romans loved applause. They wanted validation with the intensity of modern influencers. And the system trickled downward too. If you did well enough, you might become a patron to someone else, a neighbor, a relative, a worker in your shop. Suddenly, you were responsible for solving disputes, lending small sums, and ensuring people remembered how generous you were. Reputation was everything. Social standing could rise or fall based on how many people claimed you'd been responsible for their good fortune. It all sounds complicated, because it was, but Romans handled it with the ease of people who've been trained since childhood to navigate society like a maze. And since you are now a fully functional grown-up Roman, congratulations, you were doing it too, making requests, granting favors, smiling politely during conversations with people you secretly disliked. Because every relationship had potential value and potential danger. But there were lighter parts of adult life too, moments where the seriousness faded. Festivals, for instance. Rome had so many festivals that it sometimes felt like the entire calendar was one long excuse to avoid work. There were festivals for gods, for harvests, for ancestors, for good luck, for bad luck, for animals, and for absolutely no reason except tradition. During festivals, Adults relaxed. They drank, danced, ate too much, and temporarily forgot all the responsibilities that came with adulthood. Some festivals involved dressing up. Others involved games. Others involved throwing beans at ghosts. Romans were very spiritual in interesting ways. And then there were the holidays where people exchanged gifts, lit candles, or decorated their homes. Saturnalia is a famous one. The winter celebration where social hierarchies flipped upside down for a day or two. Masters served their slaves. People wore silly hats. Gambling was suddenly allowed. Adults acted like mischievous teenagers again, delightfully unburdened by dignity. Even emperors participated. Well, some of them did. Others pretended to participate while privately judging everyone involved, because emperors were professional judgers. Between festivals, daily routines, and social obligations, adult Roman life moved steadily, predictably, and yet little surprises always lurked. Maybe your neighbor announced they were suing you because your fig tree cast a shadow on their property. Maybe someone accused you of stealing their chicken, even though you didn't even like chickens. Maybe a minor earthquake shook half your pottery off the shelves. Rome was full of small dramas, and as an adult, you learned to handle them, calmly, resignedly, like every other Roman who'd ever sighed deeply while muttering about bad omens. Let's drift a little into the emotional side of Roman adulthood, something we don't talk about much. The Romans were dramatic, but they were also sentimental in their own quiet ways. They wrote affectionate letters. They told stories about lost loves. They scratched little jokes into walls. They sang lullabies. They cried at funerals. They commemorated friendships with tiny gifts or carved tokens. They cherished their families, even when they complained about them endlessly. Life was rarely gentle to the Romans. Illness came often. Politics turned violent without warning. The city was fragile, its people vulnerable, its comforts inconsistent. And because of that, the small joys mattered more. A peaceful dinner, a cool breeze, a friend dropping by, a good harvest, a healthy child, a calm evening. You, as an adult Roman, would have understood that intimately. The appreciation of the ordinary, the gratitude for the bearable moments, the humor found in daily inconveniences, the melodrama of gossip, the tenderness of sitting with someone during a quiet night, listening to distant footsteps echo through the stone streets. And so your adult life unfolded, slowly, steadily, sometimes chaotically, but always with that uniquely Roman blend of resilience, pride, superstition, practicality, and humor. You lived among marble monuments and muddy alleyways, among philosophers and fishmongers, in a world where greatness and absurdity brushed shoulders daily. And now, as we drift toward the next part of your Roman journey, imagine yourself once again under that soft lamplight, listening to the low hum of evening conversations, feeling the weight of the day settling into something calm and manageable. Let the city fade just a little as you breathe in the Roman night. Before we move on, tell me in the comments, if you had been a Roman adult, which festival do you think you'd enjoy the most? So, let's drift onward now, floating gently into another layer of your Roman adulthood. The slightly muddled, slightly comedic midlife period that most Romans didn't write glamorous poetry about. And honestly, can you blame them? Midlife in Rome wasn't especially glorious. It wasn't particularly tragic either. It was just life. The quiet churn of routines, minor catastrophes, occasional triumphs, and the steady realization that your knees are starting to make unsettling sounds every time you walk up the stairs. By this point, you've become a seasoned Roman adult. You've navigated patron networks. You attended festivals with varying degrees of enthusiasm. You survived several tax seasons, which is impressive enough to earn a small laurel wreath, if we're being honest. You've handled family dramas, business errands, and the endlessly mysterious moods of household gods. And now you're entering that phase where everything feels weirdly stable, and yet somehow constantly threatened by the petty chaos that defined Roman daily life. Let's wander gently through an average day of middle-aged Roman existence. You wake earlier than you used to, not because you're required to, but because your body has decided sleep is now optional. The city is already stirring, but you take your time rising. Younger adults rush out the door, but you've learned the ancient secret. No matter how early you leave, someone will still block the street with a cart full of amphory, arguing loudly at someone who's not even there. Rome has its own schedule, and it cares very little about yours. You might take a moment to stretch, feeling that familiar stiffness that whispers, in a very smug tone, that you are no longer 20. Perhaps you mutter a small prayer to the household spirits, more out of habit than hope, and shuffle toward your morning bread. The loaf might be stale, because Romans bought bread daily, and leftover bread was just a natural consequence of life. You soften it in wine or olive oil, because nothing in Rome was allowed to be eaten without some kind of dipping ritual. And then you step outside into the warm Roman morning, which is full of smells that can best be described as a blend of freshly baked bread, sea salt, olive oil, and absolutely everything else imaginable. Rome always smelled alive. Not necessarily pleasant, but alive. Work continues steadily. Business flows as it always has. And you move through it with the practiced rhythm of someone who's seen customers at their best and at their truly baffling worst. A man complains that your pottery looks too round. A woman insists her lamp should never need oil, as if physics is optional. A child tries to buy something with what is unmistakably a rock. You nod politely and carry on, because at this stage of life, you've accepted that the universe simply enjoys throwing strange situations at you. If you're a craftsperson or shopkeeper, your skills have grown considerably. People trust your work. They come back to you. They mention you at dinner parties in that casual, "Oh, yes, I know a guy," way that counts as high praise in Roman society. And that small, warm sense of competence settles in, a feeling that you've carved out your place in this enormous, unpredictable city. If you're part of an office or administrative position, your responsibilities likely expanded. You now deal with record keeping or supervising a team, or quietly fixing all the problems created by someone who definitely shouldn't be in charge, but owns far too much land to be questioned. Every workplace has that person. Rome invented them. Middle-aged Romans also carried a certain social weight. Your opinion mattered more. People came to you for advice, especially younger neighbors who pretended not to need advice, but clearly did. They asked about finances, market trends, the best time to plant vegetables, or whether their dream of becoming a poet should be politely abandoned. Romans were very realistic people. And yet, adulthood wasn't purely practical. There was also a rich emotional world to navigate, changing family dynamics, shifting friendships, and the gentle hum of nostalgia for simpler days that probably weren't actually simpler but feel that way in hindsight. Let's drift into that family space now. If you have children, they're growing. Maybe too fast. They've developed opinions about everything. They ask questions that take more effort to answer with each passing year. They make choices that raise eyebrows, yours and the household gods. You watch them play in the courtyard, reenacting mythical battles with wooden swords or chasing chickens with alarming enthusiasm. Sometimes they help with chores. Sometimes they break things. Roman children had a unique talent for destruction, and yet, as a parent, you treasure the chaos in its own quiet way. If you don't have children, your life still fills with people. Siblings, cousins, aging parents, neighbors who act like family whether you want them to or not, and friends who drop by with updates on everything happening in the city. The Romans had a strong sense of community, partly because they loved talking and partly because houses were close enough that ignoring people was nearly impossible. Friendships deepen as you age too. You have trusted companions now. People you've shared endless meals with, laughed with, complained with, and supported through various petty disasters. You've gone to baths together, prayed together, and endured the same waves of Roman bureaucracy. There's comfort in that familiarity, in the easy conversations, in the shared stories that grow slightly more dramatic every time someone retells them. But midlife also introduces a subtle, nostalgic awareness of time passing. Romans felt it deeply. They wrote about aging often, not dramatically, but reflectively. You might catch yourself doing the same. Maybe you look at a crack in your shop wall and think, "That's been there since I was young." Or you notice your children speak in slang you don't quite understand. Or you see a younger craftsman, fast and confident, and remember when you move with the same ease. And yet, you're far from old. You're simply seasoned, someone the city recognizes and respects. Someone who knows which vendors overcharge, which roads flood in winter, which public fountains taste faintly of minerals, and which officials are most likely to lose paperwork. This knowledge is power, in its own quietly practical way. Let's drift now into the realm of Roman leisure, the ways middle-aged adults found comfort, pleasure, and occasionally gentle amusement. The baths were still a daily ritual, perhaps even more appreciated now. The warm water soothed muscles. The social chatter provided companionship. The quiet corners offered moments of rest. You'd spend time in the tepidarium, letting warmth seep into your bones, listening to faint echoes of conversations bouncing off the stone walls. Maybe you'd get a massage from an attendant who had surprisingly strong hands and no concept of gentle pressure. But afterward, you'd feel relaxed, almost weightless, at least until you walked outside and the heat of the day reminded you that Rome is, in fact, a warm and crowded city. Entertainment also remained a fixture. Public festivals, theater performances, religious ceremonies, and the ever-popular gladiatorial games. Even if you didn't attend often, you'd hear about them constantly. People argued about their favorite gladiators the way modern fans debate sports teams. And if you wandered past the tavern in the evening, you could hear opinions being shouted with the confidence of philosophers and the accuracy of people who consume too much cheap wine. Speaking of wine, your taste might shift as you grow older. Maybe you start preferring milder wines, or more watered wines, or wines that don't smell like they were stored in the sun for too long. Age brings refinement, or at least the illusion of refinement. And then there is the matter of health. Romans worried about it constantly, not in an anxious way, but in a resigned, practical manner. You monitored your diet because Roman doctors insisted everything you ate influenced your humors. You avoided certain foods during certain seasons because some poet once warned against them. You drank herbal teas recommended by a neighbor's cousin's aunt who claimed she learned the recipe from a traveling healer. You even visited doctors occasionally, although Roman doctors were known for confidence first and accuracy maybe fifth or sixth. Still, you manage. You stay active. You walk everywhere. You lift things. You climb stairs. The Roman lifestyle, despite the occasional feast and constant bread consumption, kept people moving. And so here you are, aware of your age, but not defeated by it. Now, let's drift into the social politics of middle age. With experience behind you, you become more cautious. You know which conversations to avoid. You know when someone is fishing for information and when they're genuinely interested in your thoughts. You recognize flattery disguised as curiosity. You spot tension before arguments erupt. You become a quiet expert in reading people simply because Rome demands it. And although the empire is enormous and powerful, your personal world remains intimate. A network of familiar streets, familiar faces, familiar routines that give structure to your days. By this point, you develop preferences. Perhaps you prefer certain market stalls because the vendor smiles at you even when you buy very little. Or you visit a particular baker because their bread actually tastes like bread and not like it's holding a grudge. Or you choose one specific bathhouse because it's marginally quieter, or at least because the regulars argue in softer tones. There's comfort in these small choices, a sense of owning your life, piece by piece, amidst the unpredictable waves of Roman society. And now, let's drift quietly toward the evening again, your midlife evening. You sit with your family or your friends, or perhaps alone with the rhythmic hum of the city outside. You sip wine. You eat simple food. You listen to the day settle into silence. You reflect on your life, not dramatically, just gently, with that soft, aging wisdom that recognizes the beauty in ordinary days. Rome continues around you, bustling, chaotic, magnificent, absurd. But for now, the world narrows to your table, your thoughts, your lamp's warm glow, and you find, in that moment, a deep sense of belonging. You're part of the city, part of its heartbeat, part of its endlessly unfolding story. Before we drift into the next stage of your Roman life, let me ask you something soft and simple. If you lived in ancient Rome, what small daily ritual do you think would bring you the most comfort? Tell me in the comments. I love seeing your peaceful answers. Let's drift back into the soft haze of the ancient world, letting the clamor of the present fade into the background. By now, You walk through enough Roman hallways, dusty roads, and slightly questionable bathhouse corridors that you could probably pass for a local, not a wealthy one. Mind you, those people had names that sounded like marble chipped into syllables. You're more of a pleasantly average Roman teenager, which is still infinitely more glamorous than what most people today imagine. Although, as always, the reality comes with a touch of chaos. Because of course it does. It's Rome. So, as we settle back in, let's pick up where we left off, moving to the daily rhythms of adolescence in a world where sandals were universal. The air smelled faintly of olive oil and ambition, and everyone had an opinion on the proper angle for reclining during dinner. You'd think that kind of thing wouldn't matter, but in Rome, everything mattered a little too much. That's how empires work. They get very invested in tiny details. You awake again at what feels like an indecent hour, though the sun is probably just stretching over the rooftops. There's noise outside, the usual blend of carts, street vendors, stray dogs, and at least one man loudly pontificating about grain prices, as though the gods themselves needed an update. It's comforting in a strange way, like ancient white noise, the kind that doesn't require a subscription. As you shuffle into the main room of your Insel apartment, you find your mother already in negotiation mode with your father. The topic today appears to be whether the household should switch olive oil suppliers. You'd assume this wouldn't be a deeply emotional issue, but judging by the tone of the conversation, you'd be wrong. Your mother believes the new supplier waters down the oil. Your father believes it's just lighter and more youthful. You decide not to engage, because teenagers across all of history have known better than to get in the middle of pointless parental disputes. It's one of our few universal instincts. Breakfast is something simple, bread, maybe a smear of cheese, possibly a fig if you're feeling fancy. Romans didn't do breakfast the way modern people do. It wasn't an event. It was more of a suggestion. Just a little something to convince your stomach not to complain until lunchtime. You eat mechanically, half listening to the conversations around you, letting the soft monotony of the moment settle you. Because life, even ancient life, often feels like a loop of slightly rearranged routines. Your mother urges you to run an errand today. Pick up fabric from the dyer, drop off a message to your uncle, try not to get distracted by whatever nonsense your friends are doing. She says this last part with a look that tells you she already knows you will absolutely get distracted by nonsense. That too is universal. So out you go. The street greets you with its usual blend of liveliness and mild threat. People bustle past, carrying everything from baskets of vegetables to small goats. A baker shouts about fresh loaves, a potter arranges his wares, and a man who has clearly been drunk since dawn tries to sell authentic Etruscan relics that look suspiciously like broken roof tiles. You learn, early in life, not to ask questions. As you weave through the crowd, you're joined by your friend Sextus, who seems to materialize from nowhere the way certain ancient teenagers do, appearing suddenly, already mid-sentence about something you didn't actually ask him to tell you. This time, he's excited about a rumor that the local bathhouse is offering a new type of massage involving warm stones. You make a mental note to avoid that. The Romans loved their baths, but they also loved procedures that would be described today as lightly medieval. Sextus, of course, wants you to skip your errands and come watch a group of older boys practice for a chariot race. Not an official one, just the kind where someone inevitably breaks something, and everyone pretends they expected that outcome. You consider it. You really do. But you also remember that your mother asked for the fabric, and Roman mothers had a remarkable ability to sense when their children had failed them. You tell Sextus you'll meet him later, and he leaves dramatically, as though you've personally ruined his entire day. He'll be fine. The dyer's shop is a familiar place, strong-smelling, loud, always humid. Long strips of fabric hang overhead like subdued, colorful ghosts. The dyer himself greets you with a wave, his hand stained permanently purple, which is sort of impressive considering only the very rich are supposed to wear purple. He tells you the fabric isn't quite ready and asks you to wait a bit. Waiting in ancient Rome is just as boring as waiting anywhere else. But at least here, there's a constant stream of people coming in to haggle or complain. Roman citizens were Olympic-level complainers. They trained early and often. As you wait, you overhear two older women discussing their children. One brags about her son's exceptional handwriting. The other counters with her daughter's ability to recite entire mythological genealogies. Neither of these talents will come in handy in the real world, but that's not the point. Roman parents collected academic triumphs the way modern people collect unread books. Proudly, loudly, with a hint of delusion. You smile politely and keep listening, because eavesdropping is one of humanity's oldest hobbies. Once the fabric is finally ready, you take it and head toward your uncle's place to deliver the message. But naturally, because this is Rome and life enjoys its little detours, you stumble across a small crowd gathered around a man preaching about the end of days. He claims that the gods have grown displeased and that Rome will collapse unless everyone makes substantial offerings. You love how substantial is always left vague, which usually means as much as I can carry. People watch politely, nodding with the kind of gentle skepticism you reserve for someone who's very passionate, but also clearly misinformed. Eventually, you arrive at your uncle's. He greets you with his usual brusque warmth, handing you a piece of flatbread as if the reward for arriving on time. He asks about your schooling, your chores, your friends, and then inevitably circles back to whether you've given any thought to your future profession. Adults in Rome have a fondness for asking teenagers about their life plans, as if anyone at your age has figured out anything besides which water fountain tastes the least funny. After your errand is completed, you wander back toward the main streets. The sun is high now, and the marketplace is buzzing with a busy, almost musical rhythm. A group of artists sketch passers-by. A storyteller recounts a tale about a general who tripped over a tortoise statue, and several merchants insist, quite aggressively, that you need a new pair of sandals. It's all familiar, but comforting in that slow, sleepy way where nothing truly surprising happens, yet everything feels subtly alive. On your way home, you run into your friend Livia, who is carrying a basket of herbs and looking very pleased with herself. She tells you she convinced her father to let her attend more advanced lessons with a tutor who specializes in rhetoric. Livia has many opinions, most of which she expresses loudly, so more rhetorical training is a slightly terrifying prospect. Still, you congratulate her and she beams. People in every era love being congratulated for things they already knew they were good at. You make it home just in time for the household's midday meal. It's the biggest one of the day. Various stews, more bread, fruit, maybe even a little wine if your parents are feeling generous. Your father launches into a story about a co-worker who tried to argue with the foreman, which predictably went poorly. Your mother talks about a neighbor who keeps borrowing flour without returning the expected amount. You nod along, half listening, half lulled by the rhythmic comfort of domestic complaints. After the meal, you help tidy up, then slip out again to meet Sextus as promised. He's exactly where you expect him to be, leaning against a wall, pretending he hasn't been waiting long, even though he absolutely has. He drags you to the makeshift chariot practice area, which is basically an open courtyard with enough space for ill-advised running. The chariots are laughably small, and the horses are more like irritated ponies, but the older boys treat this with full seriousness. You watch as one boy nearly flips his tiny chariot during a turn. Everyone cheers. This is entertainment. Sextus asks if you'd ever want to race one day. You tell him you value living too much. He shrugs, probably thinking you're being overly cautious. He will understand someday, when his knees crack for the first time, and he realizes a human body has opinions about dangerous hobbies. After the excitement dies down, you and Sextus wander the district, talking about everything and nothing. An older man selling honey, Nuts tries to draw you into a philosophical debate about whether fate or choice governs human life. Sextus does not engage. You answer politely, because avoiding conflict is your superpower, and the man eventually nods approvingly, as if you've passed a test. Later, the two of you pass a small shrine where someone has left an offering of fresh flowers. You both pause, instinctively quiet, because Romans, even the loud ones, knew when to respect sacred spaces. Sextus drops a small coin into the offering bowl, just in case. You follow suit. Insurance policies come in many forms. As you walk home through dimming light, the city softens around you. The crowds thin, the vendors pack up, and the air cools. You take your time, enjoying the moment, knowing there won't be many like it before adulthood starts creeping in. Not that adulthood in Rome looks particularly appealing. More duty, more expectations, more arguing about olive oil brands. When you finally return home, the lamps are lit, casting a warm glow over the household. Your mother is sewing. Your father is reading a scroll. Your siblings are doing whatever mysterious activities siblings do. And everything feels settled, calm, predictable, in a way that lets you relax into the evening. As you lie down, you think about the day, its errands, its noise, its small victories, its absurdities. You think about how similar it all feels to now, even after 2,000 years. People are still people. Nosy, hopeful, mildly dramatic, endlessly curious, and occasionally wise. It's strangely comforting. And before sleep claims you, one last thought lingers, drifting softly across your mind like a lazy summer breeze. If you lived in ancient Rome long enough, would you eventually get used to the smell of literally everything? Something to ponder. Tell me in the comments what scent you imagine ancient Rome would have had. I'm curious which direction your imagination drifts. Let's drift back into the calm glow of ancient Rome again, letting the past unfold like a warm blanket, or at least like a blanket that smells faintly of olive oil, sun-dried linen, and the ambition of every Roman who ever decided their family simply had to rise another rung on the social ladder. By now, your teenage life in the empire is something you slip into naturally, the way a seasoned Roman might slip into a pair of worn sandals, soft, familiar, and slightly uneven, but comforting all the same. When we last left you, you've been adjusting to the usual rhythm of Roman existence, running errands, navigating parents, avoiding unnecessary drama, dodging questionable street philosophers, and trying to maintain your sanity, while your friends attempted to introduce you to entertainment that seemed specifically designed to shorten your life expectancy. So tonight we continue, gently, slowly, letting each moment drift into the next, like a lazy stream slipping between stones polished by centuries. You wake again before dawn, because Romans love sunrise in the same way modern people love complaining about alarm clocks. They didn't really, but culture insisted it was normal. The sky outside your small window glows a faint silver. Somewhere, a rooster is announcing its presence with the enthusiasm of someone who has never once considered the possibility of sleeping in. Your father is already awake, tying his sandals with the determined look of a man mentally preparing to hear at least 5 idiotic arguments at work. Your mother hums as she prepares something simple for breakfast. It's too early to identify the food, but it's warm, and that's enough. You stretch, yawn, and shuffle into the main room, where your younger sibling is already asking questions like, "Why is the sky that color?" And "Do chickens know they're chickens?" You quickly escape before you're dragged into a conversation that your half-asleep brain is not equipped to handle. After a bit of bread dipped in water wine, you're sent on another errand, this time to pick up a set of clay lamps your family ordered. The old ones still technically work, but one cracked, one flickers strangely, and one seems determined to extinguish itself at the slightest breeze. Your mother wants replacements. Your father believes a good lamp should last at least a generation. You stand quietly between them, hoping the argument resolves before lunch. It does not. The streets are cool and quiet as you head out, the early vendors setting up their stalls. A woman arranging spices sneezes loudly and blames the gods for sending too much dust. A fisherman unloads his catch, loudly insisting that every fish is absolutely fresh, despite the fact that one of them appears to be staring into the void. Rome wakes slowly, like a giant creature stretching its limbs. On your way to the lamp makers, you pass a group of boys about your age practicing their rhetoric lessons in the street. They stand in a circle, each taking turns making dramatic hand gestures and delivering speeches about imagined battles, heroic triumphs, and moral dilemmas that will confuse even the gods. One boy raises his voice passionately while pointing at his friend's forehead and shouting, "Is this justice?" His friend responds by accusing him of being soft as a boiled bean. A proud display of Roman education. Truly, you don't linger long. Listen to teenagers debate philosophy before sunrise is one of history's lesser-known punishments. The lampmaker's shop is tucked between a bakery and a slightly suspicious-looking fortune-teller stall. The lampmaker is already covered in clay, shaping new ones with the slow patience of a man who has been doing the same thing for 30 years. He greets you warmly, vanishes into back, and returns holding a small stack of beautifully crafted lamps, each with little carved patterns around the rim. You thank him, pay a few coins, and start heading home, only to be ambushed by your friend Sextus, who appears once again with the timing of a man who somehow knows exactly when you're trying to be responsible. He asks where you're headed, and you explain the lamps. He nods, thoughtfully. Then he suggests you accompany him to the forum, because apparently someone is giving a public demonstration involving a trained goat. You don't know what that means. He doesn't either. That's why he wants to go. You politely decline, explaining that you cannot drop your mother's new lamps on the ground just to watch livestock perform tricks. Sextus looks disappointed, but accepts your refusal with a sigh of a man who has suffered a terrible injustice. On the way back, you pass through a lively market area where merchants shout over one another with a volume of trained gladiators. A fruit vendor tries to lure you in by praising your excellent jawline, which is possibly the strangest marketing strategy you've encountered today. You escape quickly, clutching the lamp protectively. The last thing you need is for your mother to discover her new lamps have been swapped for a bag of slightly overripe figs. As you continue, the city begins to fill with more people. Children chase each other between vendor stalls. Old men argue loudly about politics, and dogs weave between legs with a confidence that suggests they believe they own the entire street. You take your time walking, noticing everything with that dreamy softness that comes when you're not quite awake yet, floating gently from one moment to another. When you reach home, your mother inspects the lamps with the seriousness of a general reviewing new recruits. She approves of the craftsmanship, though she still mutters something about your father's unrealistic expectations of household items. Your father, hearing this, simply declares that the old lamps weren't that bad. This is followed by a long stare between them, one that you silently slip away from because you're not emotionally equipped to referee lamp-based debates. With the errand complete, you're free until midday, so you decide to wander toward one of the quieter parts of the city. Rome could be overwhelming, loud, crowded, intense, and even teenagers sometimes needed a break from the constant dramatic energy. You walk toward the Tiber River, passing a small shrine where someone has left offerings of bread and fresh greens. A priest sweeps the area carefully, humming under his breath. You greet him respectfully, and he nods, offering a blessing that sounds both sincere and vaguely generic, as if he's repeated it thousands of times. Near the riverbank, you find a group of older women washing clothes, chatting about everything from the rising cost of wheat to which Senator's daughter eloped with a flute player. They stop briefly to look at you, assess whether you might spread their gossip, then continue without concern. You sit on a large stone nearby, watching the river drift past, its surface reflecting a soft shimmer. The water moves slowly, as if encouraging you to do the same. After a little peaceful time by the river, you head back toward the busy districts, because peace in Rome lasts only as long as you can outrun your responsibilities. You find Sextus again, who this time is deeply invested in learning how to juggle stones for reasons that remain unclear. Each stone he tosses arcs slightly off course, landing dangerously close to someone's sandal. You gently encourage him to stop before he accidentally injures an unsuspecting stranger. Sextus sighs dramatically again. Being dramatic is basically his personality. The two of you wander the city until lunchtime, talking about everything from how terrible some of your teachers are to which bakery makes the best honey cakes. A sudden rain shower passes overhead, quick and light, sending everyone into momentary chaos before the sky brightens again. Romans, despite their grandeur, were often very unprepared for weather. It's one of their enduring charms. Back home, your family gathers for another large midday meal. Today there's lentil stew, olives, bread, and a small plate of roasted vegetables that your father insists are good for strength and moral integrity. You aren't sure vegetables have moral opinions, but it's best not to question him during meals. Your mother asks about your morning, and you recount your errands, carefully omitting the part where Sextus almost hit a pedestrian with a rock. Your father grunts approvingly, which is Roman father language for good enough. Later in the day, your father asks you to visit a neighbor to help move some heavy storage jars. You agree because it's easier than refusing, and also because the neighbor pays in dried fruit, which is one of the better ancient payment methods. Moving the jars is slightly painful, but the reward of dried apricots is absolutely worth it. You savor a few on the walk home, letting the sweetness melt into the slow afternoon warmth. As evening approaches, you help your mother prepare lamps for lighting. The new ones glow beautifully, casting warm, steady light across the room. The family gathers. Your sister tells a surprisingly dramatic story about something your neighbor's dog did, and the whole household settles into the mellow rhythm of nighttime. You lie back, letting the voices blend gently around you, soft and distant. It's been a simple day. Nothing grand, nothing legendary, nothing that will ever be written on a marble plaque. But these were the kinds of days that made up most of Roman life. Quiet, ordinary, wonderfully human. Even in the greatest empire on earth. People still got annoyed about lamps, and children still asked too many questions, and friends still try to drag you into questionable entertainment involving goats. As you drift towards sleep again, wrapped in the comfortable monotony of existence, you can't help wondering, not dramatically, just lazily, what tiny moments you'd treasure most if you lived your whole life here. The smells, the sounds, the laughter, the markets, the friends, the routines, maybe even the lamps. Before you drift off completely, tell me in the comments, what part of your imaginary Roman day felt the most real to you? I'd love to hear which moments stuck with you. Let's drift back in the quiet glow of ancient Rome once more, easing into another soft, unhurried day of teenage life in the empire. Everything feels hazy at first, the way mornings do when you're half awake and not entirely convinced the sun should be allowed to exist. You open your eyes to the familiar dimness of your family's insular apartment, the air warm with the lingering scent of last night's oil lamps. Somewhere in the distance, a cart rattles over rough stone, and a vendor shouts far too enthusiastically about fresh dates. Rome rarely waits for anyone to feel fully conscious. You sit up slowly, stretching the way teenagers have always stretched, half-heartedly, with a vague sense that your joints shouldn't feel this old yet. Your younger sibling is already awake, darting past you with the unearned energy of a child who slept better than you did. Your father is tying the straps of his sandals, muttering about the upcoming workday and the incompetence of at least 3 co-workers. Your mother moves about the kitchen space, preparing something simple for breakfast, humming a tune that might be a hymn or might just be something she invented to pass the time. Breakfast, as always, is a humble affair: bread, olives, possibly a smear of cheese if yesterday's market purchases were generous. Romans didn't do elaborate morning meals. Mornings were for functioning at the bare minimum until the sun was high enough to justify real food. You eat quietly, slowly waking up, letting the quiet rhythm of family chatter wash over you. Your mother reminds you of a few errands, collecting laundry from the washerwoman, picking up herbs from a merchant, and trying not to come home with any new trouble. Her eyes linger on you for that last bit, because she's met your friends. After breakfast, you step outside into the softened morning air. The sky glows a gentle gold, and the streets are already alive. Dogs trot through alleyways as if they own the city, vendors set out their wares, and neighbors call greetings to each other like they're auditioning for the role of local loud person. You breathe deeply, adjusting to the city's early pulse. As you head toward the washerwoman's house, you're intercepted, predictably, by your friend Sextus. He pops out from behind a pillar, startling you slightly, because stealth is one of his few talents. He immediately tells you that he heard a rumor about a traveling performer who arrived in the forum, a man who can supposedly balance 12 amphorae on a head while reciting poetry. You express doubt. Sextus insists it's true. He always insists it's true. You tell him you have errands. He waves this off like it's a minor inconvenience rather than the foundation upon which your household's peace rests. Eventually, he gives in, agreeing to accompany you on your chores. This is largely because he hopes the washerwoman might share gossip. And Sextus loves gossip almost as much as he loves questionable entertainment. The washerwoman greets you with her usual brusque warmth. She's already wringing out a sheet, muscles working with impressive precision. She eyes Sextus suspiciously. She knows trouble when she sees it, but hands you your folded laundry anyway. As she does, she mentions that the neighbor down the street has been loudly arguing with his wife all morning. Something about a missing chicken. The chicken, it seems, has not been located. Sextus nods solemnly, as if this is deeply important political information. With laundry collected, you head toward the herb merchant. The marketplace is getting busier now. Vendors calling out prices, customers haggling, children weaving between stalls chasing each other, and a goat wandering around like it's shopping. The herb merchant greets you with a grin, already knowing what your mother wants. He hands you a small woven pouch of fresh herbs, insisting this batch is particularly fragrant. He then proceeds to offer you advice about sleep, digestion, and fortune, none of which you asked for, all delivered with absolute confidence. Sextus, meanwhile, is distracted by a small crowd forming around a man with a cage of doves. The man claims he can predict a person's romantic future by observing which dove they attract. You decide not to participate because the last thing you need is a bird deciding your destiny. Sextus, however, considers it. You drag him away gently. As you leave the market, the sound of a heated argument erupts nearby. Two older men stand at a fruit stand shouting at each other about whether the apples are overpriced. One man declares that the seller is committing a crime against the gods. The seller responds by calling him an ungrateful cabbage. You walk away slowly, savoring the uniquely Roman ability to turn minor inconveniences into fiery debates. Errands finished, you and Sextus wander toward the forum. The city is in full swing now, buzzing with midday energy. You pass a group of students reciting poetry dramatically under the supervision of their teacher, a man who looks like he's been tired for 15 years. You pass a group of soldiers polishing armor, chatting casually about last night's dice games. You pass a potter arranging his wares, muttering about someone who keeps stealing his best clay. The life of Rome unfolds around you in easy, chaotic layers. At the forum, there is indeed a traveling performer, but he's juggling knives, not balancing amphory. Sextus is only mildly disappointed. You watch from a distance, not trusting the knives of the juggler or the laws of physics. The crowd applauds politely, except for one man who loudly comments that his cousin can juggle better. Rome is full of critics. After a while, the two of you find a spot near the fountain to rest. The water glitters softly, and people drift in and out, filling jars, rinsing hands, cooling their faces. You sit in the shade, letting the calm seep in. Sextus talks about nothing and everything. His father's work, his mother's obsession with buying new cushions, his sister's upcoming wedding to a man who collects miniature horse statues. You listen half present, half floating. Eventually the sun climbs high enough that it's time to head home for the main meal of the day. You walk the familiar streets, the noise swelling around you like a warm tide. Your home is cool inside, shaded by heavy curtains and thick walls. Your mother greets you with a nod, approving the herbs. Your father is already seated, carving slices of bread. Lunch today is hearty, lentils, olives, and a bit of roasted fish your father brought home. You all eat together, the conversation drifting lightly from neighbors to whether to what the priest said during last week's ceremony. After the meal, you help clear the table, then step outside again to enjoy the quiet hours of the afternoon. The streets are calmer now. Many people rest. Some nap. Some sit outside chatting lazily. Rome, despite being the bustling heart of a mighty empire, knows how to slow down in the afternoon heat. You decide to visit a small park-like area near a temple, one of the few places where greenery softens the edges of stone buildings. A few children play with a wooden hoop. An older couple sits beneath a tree, sharing a snack. A philosopher sits cross-legged, explaining something complicated to a young man who nods too quickly to be truly understanding. You sit under a tree and let your mind drift. The leaves rustle overhead. The air is warm, but not uncomfortably so. The world feels steady. Sextus eventually finds you again. He has an uncanny ability to track you down and announces that a local baker is testing new sweet pastries and giving away samples. You go with him, because even Romans understood that free pastry should never be ignored. The baker hands you a warm, honey-filled treat that nearly melts in your hand. You savor it slowly, the sweetness settling across your senses like a soft blanket. The day winds into evening. Lamps begin to glow in doorways. Voices soften. Even the dogs seem calmer. You run one last errand, taking a message to a neighbor about a borrowed jug. Then return home where your mother is preparing the lamps of night. The new ones shine steady and warm, just as she hoped. Your family settles in together. Your father tells a story from his childhood, involving a runaway cow and a wall that definitely wasn't stable. Your mother sews, humming that same tune again. Your sibling draws shapes in a small patch of dust on the floor. Everything feels peaceful in that understated, ancient way. When you finally lie down to rest, you feel the familiar weight of the day settle into your bones. It was an extraordinary day. It won't be carved into stone. It won't be recited by poets. But it was real, soft, human. One of the countless invisible days that make up a lifetime. And as you drift towards sleep, you find yourself wondering, quietly, lazily, what small, ordinary moment from a day will stick with you the most. The pastries? The fountain? The arguments about fruit prices? The wandering goat? Tell me in the comments, which moment from your imaginary Roman afternoon felt most relaxing to you? Let's drift gently now into the final stretch of our long, slow wander through ancient lives and sleepy corners of history. By this point, you probably settled deeper into your pillow, maybe noticing the warmth of your blanket, or maybe you managed to drift off 3 or 4 times and returned confused, wondering what century we're in. That's perfectly fine. History is patient like that. It doesn't mind repeating itself. It's been doing that for thousands of years. So, as we settle into these closing thoughts, let's float a bit away from the streets of ancient Rome, from its noisy markets, from the overworked teachers and the teenage barbershop philosophers, from the slightly dehydrated emperors blaming their problems on omens and birds. We'll let all of that fade behind us. Because before we say goodnight to this long, drowsy journey, it's nice to sit with the part that historians rarely admit, which is that, for all our fascination, most ancient people were simply human. Very tired, very confused, trying their best with a limited number of spoons they had each day. Not too different from us. Really, take, for example, the Roman father trying to keep track of his children, his farms, his taxes, his household gods, and his slightly unstable neighbors. He probably felt overwhelmed in ways that would feel familiar. Or the Roman mother, doing everything from weaving to managing finances, to quietly fixing all the mistakes of the men around her. Or the Roman teenager, rolling their eyes at curfews while knowing that they have absolutely no control over their life. If that sounds relatable, don't worry. You're in good ancient company. And so, in a way, part of the quiet charm of ancient Rome, when you slow your pacing and lower your voice and whisper your way through the details, is how completely normal people were, even when they were surrounded by marble or forced into tunics, or told to worship emperors who couldn't go 3 weeks without doing something spectacularly foolish. Life in the slow moments was pretty soft-edged. Wake up, do your chores, pray to your household shrine, complain about something, eat something questionably fresh. Try not to get trampled by a passing cart. Repeat as necessary. As we float past these ordinary routines, it's easy to imagine the quieter side of a Roman evening. Picture a courtyard dim and warm, with a small oil lamp flickering beside a bowl of olives. Maybe a mother is unraveling a bit of wool, while her daughter practices a tune on a reed flute. Maybe a father is sitting back, trying not to think about taxes, pretending he can't hear the neighbors arguing again. Maybe a teenager is staring at the ceiling, wondering what's beyond the horizon. Because every teenager in every era does that. And around them, the city hums. Sleepy, but not entirely asleep. A dog barks. Someone drops a clay pot and curses quietly. A late-night baker needs dough for the morning rush. A night watchman taps his staff against the stones, pretending he isn't scared of the dark. It's peaceful in a way that cities can be peaceful, full of gentle noise and tired people. Even the elites, who spent their days dripping in silk and politics, had their softer, quieter moments. They might sit on a cushioned couch, sipping water wine and telling themselves that tomorrow they absolutely will stop sponsoring gladiatorial games they can't afford. They probably didn't, of course, but the thought was there. Ambition rarely sleeps, even when it should. And somewhere far above, in a palace lit by expensive lamps, an emperor might be lying awake because the priest told him Mercury was in retrograde again, or because his astrologer hinted something deeply troubling about next month's stars. The emperor might pretend he doesn't care, but he absolutely does. Even the most powerful person in the world was still dramatically affected by the cosmic equivalent of today's horoscope column. That's the thing about ancient Rome. You can peel away the military victories, the shiny mosaics, the stern statues, and you're left with people who were, honestly, just muddling through. People who argued about chores. People who forgot birthdays. People who hoped their children wouldn't embarrass them at temple. People who had awkward friendships and stubborn relatives and worries that kept them awake at night, even in a time before coffee. It's that soft humanity that lets us drift so gently through these stories. Because when you look closely, so much of history is just life. The big events make the headlines, sure. But the real shape of a civilization lies in the tiny, sleepy, repetitive moments. The ones no one bothered to write down. The ones hidden between the lines of grand inscriptions and important speeches. And that's why, before we end, it feels right to revisit the teenagers who started this journey with us. Those young Romans navigating their complicated world with equal parts frustration and fascination. They weren't just little adults. They were, well, teenagers. They worried about acne. They stressed about exams carved into wax tablets. They whispered gossip at bathhouses. They made crush-related decisions that would haunt them for months. They got annoyed when their parents reminded them for the fourth time to say their prayers properly. You might think, looking back at all the marble ruins and solemn statues, that life back then was impossibly serious. But watching a Roman teenage boy try desperately to impress someone at a festival while tripping over his own sandals? That breaks the illusion instantly. Watching a Roman teenage girl roll her eyes at yet another lecture about virtue from people who absolutely did not practice it themselves? That brings you back to earth very quickly. It's funny how much comfort that brings. The thought that, for all the centuries between us, the emotional landscape hasn't changed that much. We still want approval. We still want to feel competent. We still worry about the future. We still suspect the older generation might, possibly, be exaggerating about how hard they had it. And we still find ways to laugh, even if we're supposed to be solemn. So, in these final calm minutes, let's drift through a soft reflection of what it meant to be alive back then. Not a soldier, not an emperor, not a philosopher conjuring complicated theories to impress their friends. Just a human being trying to get through the week. Life in ancient Rome, beneath all the grandeur, was largely about balance. Trying to keep your household running smoothly. Trying to stay on good terms with your neighbors. Trying not to incur the wrath of the gods, or at least hoping they were too busy bothering someone else. A lot of it was simply routine. Predictable. Quietly repetitive. And in that repetition, there's something, well, comforting. Almost meditative. Even the seasonal rhythms were gentle. The warm months when markets spilled into the streets. The cooler months when families gathered closer around their humble fires. The festivals came and went with predictable joy, predictable chaos, and predictable hangovers the next morning. Time moved in slow circles. Days blended together. Years slipped by with rituals and chores marking their passage. If you've ever had that odd feeling that life sometimes loops, repeating itself, you fit right in. And so, as we float toward the end of this long, sleepy journey, it seems fitting to leave you not with grand lesson, not with moralizing, not with an emperor's proclamation, but with quiet, oddly soothing truth. Most of history is ordinary, and that's what makes it feel like home. Even the most dramatic civilizations were, beneath the surface, full of people who were tired, hopeful, confused, affectionate, anxious, and occasionally doing their best despite having absolutely no idea what they were supposed to be doing. It's a strangely comforting reminder that everyone in the past was just trying to be okay, just like us. Now, before we slip fully into our closing remarks, I'll leave one last soft question for you to ponder as you relax, or drift off, or stare thoughtfully into the dim light of your room. If you had been a teenager in ancient Rome, what part of your life today would you miss the most? Tell me in the comments if you feel awake enough. Your thoughts always make these nighttime journeys a little warmer. And now, very gently, let's settle into our final closing. Thank you for spending this long, sleepy stretch of time wandering through ancient history with me. If your eyes are heavy, that's perfect. If you're still awake, I'm impressed, but also slightly concerned. Either way, I'm grateful you're here. If you enjoyed drifting through ancient Rome tonight, feel free to like the video or subscribe for more slow, soothing dives into the past. Sharing it helps too, especially if you know someone who falls asleep faster to the sound of dusty history than to actual sleep aids. Before we fade out, I'll leave you with one last thought. If you could choose any era for your next sleepy time travel journey, which one would lull you the most? Let me know in the comments when you wake up. For now, rest well, sleep deeply, and may your dreams be free of Roman chores, philosophy exams, and suspiciously crunchy bread. Good night.